All right, well, it is the week leading up to the HTA range day. I took a week off after the holiday weekend just to work on some passion projects and train. Did quite a bit of shooting and some kit tweaking and preparation for HTA, albeit. But a lot has happened since Labor Day. So in this little episode, I'll be providing my thoughts on some cherry-picked headlines. As for the quote, it felt only right to use this particular one with selection season in full swing and the rhetoric spinning up and only becoming more hateful and divisive. But let's jump into it.
Evil is evil. Lesser, greater, middling. It's all the same. I'm not judging you. I haven't only done good in my life either. But now, if I have to choose between one evil and another, then I prefer not to choose at all.
All right, I have ran away on my lunch to record a quick solo episode. So apologies up front for being a week late in posting an episode. After Labor Day, actually during Labor Day, I took on a rather ambitious project, of wrapping my bike. And it turned out to be, well, actually I ignored the only rule I need to keep in mind when taking on a project like that with my car or my bike, is that any 30-minute job is going to end up being at least 5 hours, and you will break at least one or two things and spend 5 times more than you anticipated, and that turned out to be the case here. So instead of wrapping it, I ended up painting most of it, which was super fun, disassembling it, taping it off, prepping it for paint. But it's like 95, 98-ish% done, so I should have it done and on the road by Thursday this week, just in time for fall to get here and the weather to become freezing, as it does in this state. But let's see. What do we want to start with? Georgia shooter. I think that is what we're going to go in on here. That's obviously the big ticket item here. And honestly, and I will fully admit, I'm not an avid news consumer anymore, even though I have bought a TV. Something I haven't owned for over 2 years. Finally bought a TV, still don't watch the news. Seems to be pretty quiet lately. No, I haven't really heard much about it. After I think it came out that, well, I'll just say that there was a very full bingo card for this one. But before I go any further, I guess, let me say I will not be saying the name of the animal who carried out the act. Instead, I think I'm going to open this little portion with the names of the victims. Mason Schermerhorn, 14-year-old student. Christian Angulo, 14-year-old student. Richard Aspinwall, who was a teacher, and Christina Iremi, also a teacher. Apologies if I did not get those names right. Again, as not a consumer of the news, they're not names I have heard, but those are the 4 victims of this animal who carried out this horrific act, whose name and picture I will not share, as any sort of sharing of the limelight, any attention that they get as individuals only furthers their martyr status, and they just deserve to rot. But anyways, under the bingo card, first things first, way to go, good old boys in blue, baby. The law enforcement saying what they say almost every single time here, that the shooter was indeed on their radar, and in fact, he could not have been more on their radar. He was not only a bit of a spicy poster on the internet, he was a member, an active member on a Sandy Hook fandom page. And you heard that right, a page that celebrated, that held up on a pedestal the events that took place at Sandy Hook. And as if you needed any excuse to, really watch somebody closely to make sure they don't carry out a vicious act if we must have the state as pervasive as they are today. That's a pretty easy layup if you ask me. And oh yeah, last year they actually paid him a visit because he openly made a post threatening to carry out a school shooting, and they still did nothing. So let me be clear, I'm not calling for the police to kick down your door if you make a scary post or a bad post, and I'm not saying that his post was good and that they shouldn't have done anything with him, but we are forced to be subjected to the state and their monopoly on violence that they have today. And if we are forced to be subjected to them, regardless of whether we give consent or not, they promise us safety and stability. And so instead of going after those people who tweet jokes about elections, maybe you actually arrest the people who make such open threats. I think that makes a lot of fucking sense. If we have to be subjected to these asshats, maybe they actually do their job and keep us safe. Novel idea, but that's sort of what everyone expects, and there's not enough outrage about that, I think. But yes, another failing on law enforcement, and you can mark that spot on your bingo card that he was indeed, or it rather, the shooter that being, was indeed on law enforcement's radar. Point two, and this one probably also contributes to the fact as to why it's already sort of getting hushed and moved out of the way. The shooter was indeed, it seems, based on social media bio and other accounts, that he was indeed trans. And that the act was carried out due to the school not being progressive enough, it sounds like, with that particular agenda. Not unlike the Nashville shooter, minus the anti-Christian rhetoric from what I can tell. And this is another thing I need to clarify as well. There is nothing wrong with flying the rainbow flag. There's nothing wrong with being a part of the LGBT. It is the way in which it is wielded, or the agenda, I guess, for lack of a better term. As much as I hate that term because it's sort of been politicized, the agenda's been politicized and wielded sort of like a whip. It's forced on a lot of people by the state, by state institutions. And the ironic part is, I believe it was a public school. Someone correct me if I'm wrong in this case. That's probably the most progressive place that kid went to in his entire life, honestly. So odd that he chose to lash out in that manner, the way that he did there. But just wanted to make sure it was clear there's nothing wrong with flying the rainbow flag. There's nothing wrong with, identifying as such. I do think there is something to be said about it being shoved down the throats of kids at a particular age while their brains are developing, instead of letting them figure things out on their own without it being so loud and in your face. And I think this is an excellent example as to why it's probably not a good idea. I'll leave that at that, and I had something I'll probably circle back on with that. Point number 3 on the bingo card, parents dropped the ball, just like several others. The mom even called the school the day of, trying to warn them that something really bad was going to happen. Why didn't you do anything? And the father is now on trial as well, as I think he's being charged with counts of involuntary manslaughter and second-degree murder for allowing his kid access to the weapon used. As you should, if you're going to be a responsible wielder of firearms, you need to be aware of who has access to them. It should only be you, quite frankly, unless your family or your community rather is of sound mind. And if they're not, there's no shot in hell anyone who is not of sound mind or who has disturbing thoughts has access to them. That's your duty, whether it be the law or not, to safely store them and keep control over them at all times, whether you're there or not, honestly. The one thing, and this is where I'm going to do a little bit of circling back here, that does not follow the usual script is that this particular asshole was actually detained. He was actually arrested. He did not turn the gun on himself, nor did law enforcement completely pepper him with bullets and put him down. In fact, if you look at the timeline of the shooting, it took one officer responding and confronting him to cause him to surrender. That was it. Something to be said there. I don't know what it is. It's just odd that that doesn't really match the particular pattern that we have seen in instances like this. But I hope you put this animal in a fucking cage and you dissect him and you pick him apart and you find out what happened and why, and use him as a case study. Because I would love to know what flipped the switch and why. I think there's a pretty good gut feeling, considering there's a nice trend, not a nice trend, but a pretty consistent trend of these particular flavor of shootings that needs to be sort of brought into the light and looked at. And it's a human issue, so I'm not saying it's going to be just one thing that caused it. Of course, there's going to be several contributing factors, but a pattern's a pattern. I'm not going to say that it is the cause, because I just don't know. I could only really point that there's a certain... To ignore the pattern would be silly, and to not talk about it or to make people shut up about it is just as silly, right? Like, you have to acknowledge it's something strange. This anomaly that only takes place in this country, one, and then it's an anomaly that's carried out by people with similar backgrounds and identities, also is something that needs to be looked at more seriously and talked about in the open, and not in a non-political way at all. Unfortunately, that will never happen, because everything related to this is a political matter, from the very place it took place at, to the tool that was used, to the very person who carried it out is also now. Everything is just political, unfortunately, and so we have no chance of it actually being looked at by the right people in the right setting, in using the right sort of dialogue and rhetoric. It just will never take place, unfortunately. All this to say, though, it just is another example of the failing of the state, and obviously hearts. We got to get our prayers, hearts, whatever your particular belief is. Goes out to the victims, the families of the victims, because it's the greatest tragedy that can ever happen. Especially if it's your kid, you send off to school. It's truly inconceivable, and it's something that's totally avoidable. In several places it could have stopped, at home, at the school. It's just, and I'm trying my hardest, that's why I'm sort of stumbling over my words here, trying my hardest not to repeat what I said in an earlier episode about, these instances of school shootings, and how they are just perfect examples of negligence on the state's part, because I think that's good on its own. I tried to leave that episode in a place where it's pretty blanketed. You can apply it to most instances of a school shooting, and it's going to hold up pretty well, I think. But yeah, just pointing out that, and I don't know, I know a lot of people are saying, oh, it's election season, we got to spin this up. I don't think it has that feel. I think it feels like a lot of the ones we've seen in the past, especially in this year and past, the last one before rather, considering the pattern, with the exception that this asshole wasn't willing to die for his sick and twisted beliefs. Something we said about that too. Do I think he should rot in prison for the rest of his life? Part of me says no, because my tax dollars already go to so much, right, that I don't really care for. One of them isn't keeping something like that alive. At the same time, though, I can say the exact same thing, that my tax dollars go to so much already. Why not just give this guy the worst, life imaginable, assuming that life in prison is going to be really bad? The other part of me just says, just smoke him, right? He doesn't have the right to live, since he took that right from so many others and thought that he could, that it was the right idea to take it from so many others. But regardless, I hope they dissect his brain while he's still alive, because fuck that asshole, and hopefully we can learn something of substance and of value about him to change something about the way things are sort of taking place in schools, and prevent anything like that or any other versions of him from popping up again, even though, again, it won't happen due to being a political issue. Bit of a lighter topic, though, because that's a tough one to kick off. It's obviously pretty dark, it's heavy, there's no good outcome that can never come from any of it. This also really isn't positive either, but I just thought it was funny as I was scrolling through some of the latest headlines at work through the week. We found another way to lean on our greatest ally to restrict our own freedoms. And this one requires a great deal of mental math, but essentially, I'm just going to read the headline, I guess. So Treasury releases Deputy Secretary's letter about Hamas and crypto. So essentially, and this is, I can tell you exactly this is going to happen. The geniuses in the Treasury and the Deputy Secretary, whatever the fuck, looked at Hamas's finances, transaction history, or whatever the fuck, and found there's a great deal of crypto being involved to, help fuel the terrorist organization. Odd timing, though, for the state to lean on Hamas to further discredit and encourage government regulation and oversight and restriction of crypto, as we are in the greatest ally sort of era and protecting Israel. I thought that was goddamn hilarious, because it just sort of goes to show it doesn't matter who's in charge, doesn't matter what the separation of power looks like, what the Constitution says. They will just take anything, some war that we have no business being involved in by proxy or direct, and say, you know what, the bad guy's using that payment method, therefore the government should control it, or restrict it, or oversee all of it. Which obviously seriously disheartening if you are someone who believes in crypto sort of being the decentralized sort of currency, not state controlled. I'm someone who, not as educated on the crypto topic as much as I'd like. I made a good chunk of change off of it, not as much as I would have liked either. But it's one, it stands for something that's good, right? It's currency out of the state's control, where they're not printing the money, at their own will, or at the will of another government who needs it because they decided to fight their neighbor, or we sort of egged their neighbor on to attack them. Either way, it's a decentralized currency, and I see that as a net positive overall. And the government, of course, seeing its great success, blowing up in markets and people making money on it. Obviously, they need to be able to get in on the action, and doing it legitimately would just be too hard, and so they will lean on their, not immunity, but their infinite pool of power to force themselves into any market, any asset, any scenario, regardless of how legal it is, if there's any legal precedent at all, even for that matter, simply for, only the greater good of the world, of course. It wouldn't be because they want to get in on it and they would seek to benefit by crippling and, sort of bottlenecking this asset category as a whole. So I thought that was pretty funny that, now, because our greatest allies at the forefront, we need to use their current enemy as the reason why Bitcoin and crypto as a whole must be, kept in check by the powers that be at the federal government. I'm sure it'll only work out really well, because everything they touch, is only super solid. Like infrastructure is great here. The roads aren't falling apart. The electrical grid isn't, in absolute shambles. City planning's turned out really well. We're not just destroying the world with, every decision that they make. So I'm sure, and inflation too, we've done such a great job at managing that. That yeah, I'm sure crypto though, they'll get it right this time. And sort of in the same vein of just pure government incompetence and bureaucracy, Chicago continues to fall and is at risk of losing its spot as the third largest city. The population decline has been taking place. In fact, every year since 2016, there's been a net decrease or outflow of people living in Chicago. The greatest being in 21 and 22, like huge chunks. And I'll make sure to drop the chart of the population change year over year of Chicago here. But what I find funny is that the mayor of Chicago went on the record, and you know what the reasons were, he said, for this decline? He said, the lack of affordable housing, loss of jobs, and closed schools and mental health clinics have impacted many of Chicago's communities and disproportionately hurt Black Chicagoans in particular, he said. Johnson, in the statement, appeared to question the findings, saying it is likely that the data inputs are not current enough to reflect the rebound of international migration and the recent inflow of asylum seekers. Whew. way to make that a race thing for no fucking reason. But first of all, there's the quiet part, right out loud with all this immigration horseshit taking place, right? But second, even if the lack of affordable housing, loss of jobs, closed schools, and mental health clinics were the only reasons, now I do believe that they are absolutely contributing factors to the city's demise, but these are all government-controlled things. Why hasn't he done anything about fixing it? Every single one of those are state-controlled, right? Like the economy, affordable housing, the closed schools, the closed mental health clinics, like that's all state stuff. So why is it like that? You're saying that, first of all, you're completely ignoring the big elephant in the room, which is exactly what I will get to in a moment here. But to point out those things as if to hide the fact that, you know, I'll say it, your rampant violent crime rate, your gun violence rate, your gang violence rate is higher than any other city in America. And only these issues are the only ones that are causing your city to lose people living in it year over year since almost 10 years now, is insane, because those are still things that your office controls, buddy. So what are you doing? The best part is he doesn't even owe like a response, doesn't even give a response as to how he's going to turn that shit around. It's quite the Chicago thing, honestly. But I do need to clarify a little bit on the immigration topic. And much like my stance and what I sort of elaborated on earlier about identifying as part of the LGBT community, immigration, asylum seekers, those are all net positive things, I do believe. But, and this really applies to everything across the board that's related to this, I still hold that the state, like everything that they touch, has only made those processes, those institutions, you know, the idea of immigration and asylum seeking so much worse, and in turn has made our country less safe for their own benefit through the policies, or lack thereof, that we have observed, especially over the past several years, letting in anyone and everyone without any sort of vetting, diverting taxpayer resources to them, like flying them wherever the fuck they want for free, giving them free phones, free meals, free housing, free healthcare. Where's I going with that? And just the overall, you know, incompetence and greed that the state has wielded. They've sort of taken immigrants and asylum seekers like a weapon, right? And they've only used them to further solidify the government wealth and power while leaving us in a worse response, right? Like, we have no means to adequately protect ourselves, our loved ones, or even our pets, if you are in certain Haitian areas, it would seem lately. But I can't really fully blame the immigrants in this case, right? Like, a lot of the times, and I'll go back on this as well, you know, they're coming from a really shitty place and they're only doing what they know here. Hell, they got a free ticket to ride. Why would you not take that? And if you don't know any better, yeah, you're going to kill the geese, you're going to kill the seagulls in the park. And I don't really care too much for the geese or the seagulls, really, but eating people's pets probably isn't very cool. But there are, obviously, and there has been a lot lately, headlines and just crimes overall that have taken place by particular bad actors in this sort of immigrant/asylum seeker group, you know, rapes, murders, both of those combined, just running rampant, and there's not a whole lot being done to really, you know, fix that or to prevent that. Even repeat offenders, nothing's really being done about them either. So I can't really, in that case, yes, obviously I blame the animal that, you know, completely decides to violate natural rights and decides that that's the right thing to do and that they can do that. But at the same time, I still blame the state in that case, because that situation is forced upon me, and I don't have any other means to go about dealing with it other than just hoping and praying that the state keeps me safe, and then is somehow able to adequately repay me when myself, my family, my pet, whatever is murdered, stolen from, raped, whatever you say. It just isn't, it's not conducive, right? Like, if the state stepped back and if you know, open borders, fuck it, say the state magically dissolves, open borders happen, sort of what we're seeing now, but you have people, good people, you know, the people who return the shopping carts in these communities, you know, taking, not outsourcing, but rather insourcing their own safety, their community's safety, the outcome would look very different. And obviously, I'm not saying it's going to just happen overnight, but I've always said that you let the good people off the chain, whereas they're not, their entire livelihoods aren't threatened, their entire financial health isn't threatened the second they decide to, rightfully defend themselves and their loved ones. The world looks very different, because right now the good people are very much hampered, right? Not even just socially, right? Being a gun owner, unfortunately, it's demonized in circles that aren't really our own, right and left. I will say the right doesn't do nearly enough, and the left just hates it overall. But if you take away a little bit of that, I don't know if that's going to fully ever really go away. But if you take away the legal and the financial threat of, making that decision where I'm going to draw and I'm going to keep myself and my family safe, I think the entire scenario changes, right? Someone's not doing the mental math in their head of, if I do this, I can face life in prison. I'll never financially recover from it. And also, I may not even be comfortable leaving the house with a weapon in the first place, because if I do, the same applies. And oh yeah, I'm more likely to be arrested and taken to jail because they know I'm not really a threat. I'm not a dangerous criminal, right? Like, they're way more comfortable. The state's going to be way more comfortable kicking down my door, using force, and arresting me. Maybe because I misfiled a piece of paper, or I didn't have a particular card on me at the time when I decided to leave the house with my weapon. Or maybe I'm carrying a type of ammunition that, they deemed as inappropriate, but I feel like it's the proper way to adequately defend myself. You take away all that little ticky-tacky bullshit, and you go back to, a gun behind every blade of grass. People think twice, I think, before, or people who aren't, I'd say people who are of mental, capacity, who have like half a functioning brain and a room temperature IQ, are probably going to think twice before, stepping onto your property, trying to take your pet, trying to prey upon you or your family. And I have no doubt that those who have less than room temperature IQ and less than half a brain, they're probably going to get weaned out very quickly when that switch sort of flips in that sort of theoretical setting, and those good men and women are sort of left off the chain. That's really a long-winded way of saying I have no problem with immigrants, the asylum seekers, so long as, that's why you're here. If you're coming in here just to rape, pillage, eat people's pets, I really don't have any sort of compassion for you. At the same time, I still hate the government just as much as I hate you. But for the most part, I do think, there's a good chunk of people who are coming into here for the right reasons. They want a better life. They do want to work. It's like assimilate, to a certain degree. I'm not saying you have to be white, obviously. This is the great melting pot. So, your culture is welcomed here. That's what makes this place great. I mean assimilate in the sense where you're not coming in here to prey on other people and violate their natural rights. So I'll condense that even further because I was rambling a little bit there. Immigration, asylum seeking equals good. The flavor in which that we are subjected to, that is forced upon us, along with the conditions that the government has sort of sprinkled on top of this as well, is just piss poor, and is like just making the world a lot less safer of a place, and it's really turning up the temperature. I mean, if you look at Britain, if you look at Ireland, spilling over, and not great because, and I elaborated on this earlier, maybe, we're fighting with each other again, right? Like it's brother versus brother and not brother versus the state. And I really hate everything like that. This is the same thing as like the LGBT sort of dialogue. And I believe it was Soder, the comedian, I think, I'll have to go back. He was on Andrew Schultz's podcast, and he was saying that if you go back and you look, at the Google sort of term charts, you can see when certain words were used and their prevalence like over time. And if you go back, I believe it was like 2012 or 2016, everything, that had to deal with like, trans, gay, everything LGBT, it spiked, it skyrocketed, it took off. It was almost non-existent, or, I mean, obviously wasn't non-existent, but like the level that it's at today, that ramp up started around then when you had people, occupying Wall Street, when you had people, protesting the banks and stuff, saying, we're the 99%, that rhetoric got spun way up. And his theory is that it was really a way to pit people, me and you, against each other. Red and blue hate it, right? They hate either side's view of it. So they're going to go at each other's throats and not, the problem in front of them.
Do you ever see those Nexus charts where they track words that are used in the big corporate media outlets? Mentions of the word racism in the New York Times, mentions of the word transgenderism or toxic masculinity, all these things. At 2011, 2012, it's like, and then it skyrockets up. All of them in unison, all just started doing it.
Like election time.
Well, it was on the heels of the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement and like all these, you got a bunch of leftists standing outside the big banks screaming, we are the 99%. And then all of a sudden, the entire corporate media and the entire political class decided, what we want to talk about is transgender bathrooms, because that is the burning issue of the day. And it pits right-wingers and left-wingers against each other, fighting over something that is no threat to power. The message of it was, we are the 99%.
And we're getting robbed by the...
And we're getting robbed by the... And they didn't even really mean 99%. They meant like 99.9%. They were like, it's the people who own banks against the rest of us.
And so I'll try to find that clip and drop it in here as well, because I thought that was a very interesting observation. And I think it applies to the immigration situation as well, because not only have they sort of made our own backyards less safe, and the trust in our neighbors, in our society continues to just plummet because of the state. We're so caught up in that sort of immediate sort of perceived threat, we aren't able to sort of get through that fog and point fingers just fingers, at the state and at the people who forced that on us. So my thoughts there. But anyways, back to Chicago. It's not just the issues that their wonderful mayor pointed out, contributing to the fall of the population. If you look at Chicago, their crime numbers versus LA and New York, you can combine LA and New York, it looks like, and maybe even double it after you combine them, and you're probably getting close to Chicago numbers at that point. And I have gun violence, homicide and shooting victims year over year as well. I'll drop if you are a video enjoyer here. But with such a high crime rate, with such a violent city, despite it having the strictest laws in the country, and despite it having a 10.25% tax rate, which is, I believe, it's the 8th highest overall in the country. He just can't conceive why, I guess I just find it odd, right, that those parts aren't really talked about, that it's much more expensive to live there. It's much more dangerous to live there than any other city in America. But it's just, affordable housing, which is an issue all over the country, by the way. It's not just a Chicago thing. I would also say the mental health clinics or maybe lack of insane asylums, thanks Reagan, is also a nationwide problem. Closed schools, probably the same thing as well. And loss of jobs. Those are all nationwide issues that aren't just, specific to Chicago. So a swing and the miss on Mr. Mayor there and trying to identify why his city is just hurting so much. It's definitely not the incompetence of the state and creating a more violent environment than anywhere else in the country, while also taking more and more in taxes and being unable to really point to any sort of improvement through paying those taxes. But I can tell you this, they are going to try to solve the lack of affordable housing, the loss of jobs, and closed schools and mental health clinics with more taxes, though I can guarantee it. And so let's use history here. At least since 2016, we'll keep it real recent, right? Since, the decline became a consistent thing. Let's use, our knowledge of, recent history to probably take a wild stab and say that those taxes probably aren't going to solve those problems. My guess. So how do you really change anything in the case of Chicago, I guess? I've thought about this a while. I want to make sure I word this appropriately with the particular season looming over us here this year. I say you, quote unquote, vote the way those who have left since 2016 have. I think you just fucking leave. You do what you can to stop supporting and tolerating the state in any way in that case, and you leave them with less, and hopefully over time you leave them with nothing. Now, it is important, so like I mentioned about recent history here, for those leaving, I beg that they learn from their experiences though, and they don't think that they can just apply the same political ideology somewhere else. You'll simply just breed Chiraq 2.0 wherever you go, regardless of whatever color you prefer your government to be. And the main takeaway, again, here's regardless how much you pay in taxes, you will be sacrificed to your representative's gain 10 out of 10 times. It's human nature, and it's the nature of government, so it would literally be insane to believe that any other outcome would transpire. Your safety, your prosperity is too important to outsource, so stop trusting anyone but yourself and those you trust, know, and love personally. For the same reason that you hate Xfinity, you should also hate the government in that sense, right? Like, the outsourced help will never operate at the level of satisfaction that you expect. And that's really the only thing that the government's really consistent at. It's not really meeting your expectations or your quality of work. You're simply going to be let down. And when your livelihood, your health and safety, and the safety, health, and livelihood of those around you are what is at stake, those consequences are more dire than they will be in any other situation. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we saw with the first topic today, tragically. So yeah, I think you just fucking leave. And I think that sort of goes back to what Tolstoy sort of preached in his non-violent sort of anarchist way of civil disobedience, right? His thing is just stop tolerating the state and stop participating in it at every chance you get. And now what I don't want, and what I can hear people already saying is, aha, gotcha with your quote, by leaving one state and going to another, you're simply subjecting yourself to a lesser evil. I see what you're saying, however, I still see it as different. Whereas choosing not to vote versus moving from one city to another, not really the same thing, especially when in one case, the chance of you actually being shot for doing one action is much higher than another. I see one as actually insourcing your safety, whereas the other does nothing. And I think I'm trying to speak carefully about the election thing, because I know it's a pretty divisive topic right now, voting versus not voting. And I think, unfortunately, those who want to vote in this community obviously are going to tell you to vote for one particular side, but my argument for it and where I stand today, and I've changed a little bit on this, not a tremendous amount, but I have adjusted my view and have conceded to certain points that I'm unable to argue against, and therefore do believe that they are pretty solid views. My view is that they will do whatever they want, regardless of what you say. They will get into a war with anyone that they choose, and guess who's going? It's going to be you. It's going to be your children, right? It's not going to be them. The only people who benefit from what happened in topic number 1 in any of these wars are the same people that will never go to any of these wars. You will go for them, and they will only get richer from death and destruction. And so fundamentally, I see a very large issue with that, and I have a very hard time putting my name on a piece of paper saying I support this person and I consent to them having complete immunity and omnipotent power over my body, over my life. And I have an issue with that because there's not a single one of them, nor will there ever be a single one of them that will adequately represent me, or there will never be a single one of them or any human on earth rather, that I would trust with that level of power. I would not even operate a business half as poorly as that, where the employees have carte blanche, have the company card, are able to fire, are able to make full-on decisions without any repercussions, without any sort of control. It'd be like me starting my own company and hiring a homeless guy. I'm taking a bum in, right? And saying, you are the CEO, and I trust you to run this thing right. Here are the keys. Here's my badge. You got it. Go, baby. And expecting it to work out well. And oh yeah, and handing over my badge, my keys and everything. I have no control over him. I can't get him out of the chair I put him in now if he does something that I don't like or that even severely hurts me and those that I love. No, I just have to hope and pray it all works out and that I can live another 4 years maybe where he might consider giving it up, and maybe the next person who comes in will be more qualified and turn things around and right the ship and give me back what has been taken from me and repay me for how I have been wronged, despite it never working out that way ever in history. And one thing I do want to point out is I've heard this a lot lately, and maybe if you've been plugged into the news, I'm sorry if you have, since 1813, this is not the most important election of our lifetime. That's a fucking talking point, a one-liner that has been said, yes, since 1813. Every election is going to be the most important to these jackasses. They need to rape you for their paycheck. That is the only way these slime balls can survive in this world. And if you think any one of them, for that, on that principle alone, is worthy to run the most powerful country in the world, to have the nuclear switch at their disposal, to have your life at their disposal, I think you're nuts. So yes, lesser evil, greater evil. I just see it as evil, and I cannot, with confidence or in feeling good about myself, put my name on that. And I just can't have my conscience on that, knowing I said, yes, I'm cool with this. It's just, I don't know, do I want to make this an election topic right now? I guess I did crack open the box of, Pandora's box that is the voting topic, especially now. But the rhetoric of you have to vote, it's your duty to vote, obviously is going to get turned up and spun up to 11 during an election year and during the selection season. And regardless of what you believe, and I'm going to use examples from both sides here to sort of discredit this great democratic, process, this, what's the word for it? This, not foundation, probably this great democratic process, fuck it, I'll use that. Pillar, this great democratic pillar of our amazing nation. If you're on the blue and you think that you have a say, look at what happened with your current representative, and obviously, I guess it doesn't really matter if you're blue because everyone seems to support her now anyways, but nobody voted in any sort of preliminary, any sort of primary. No individual person voted to have Kamala Harris's name on the presidential election ballot. She is not a people's choice president. Not a single civilian casted a vote for her to be on the ballot. That is not democratic. Straight up. That's just a fact. No one gets to appoint who appears on the ballot. It's supposed to be we the people, and straight up, that did not happen. So that's an issue, whether you like her or not. It, from a factual perspective, and we're speaking on a political topic here, so I know you cannot speak in facts, you cannot comprehend facts, it'll never get across. The democratic process is non-existent. It just happens. Again, they will do whatever they want for their own benefit. If they think she can win, if they think that she will carry their corpses across the finish line to greener, more financial, profitable pastures, they will force her down your throat, and that will be that, and you can do nothing about it. And if you're on the red side, I don't know how you can be so gung-ho about hammering the polls, right? When there's been so much photographic, video, and forensic evidence of fraud and of ballot tampering and of so many things, shady things going down last election with nothing changing. No one's been charged to my knowledge. Nothing has changed. I don't know how you can look at that and go, this is a sacred institution. That's the word, sacred institution. I need to get out there and I need to vote when they're just going to do whatever they want regardless. My stance, and I trust me, I know I'm trying to appeal to red and blue here. I don't think either of those are going to stick. I'm really only speaking to the few dozen people who exist in the middle and who listen to this. My view is that I don't think voting sends a message. It doesn't, because they'll do whatever they want. They'll appoint whoever they want. That'll be that. I think what sends a greater message does sort of what Tolstoy was getting at, is just the complete non-participation in the state and their institutions at every chance you can get, right? Do not support them. Minimize the amount you pay in taxes. I'm not going to give you the advice here, because none of this is legal advice, to stop paying taxes, but it is your moral obligation to pay as little in taxes as possible, but please do not go to jail, because you're much better out of jail and not as slave labor to these jackasses. But I think what is scarier to a government, it's not the status quo. This red versus blue hatred that has only gotten worse, year over year, only helps solidify their position. And I hear so many people say it now too, red and blue, there's no fucking difference, until every 4 years comes around and it's election time, and the difference couldn't be wider for these same asshats, right? So, where's it going? Fuck. Where's it going with that? I think what scares them more than anything, what would scare me more than anything, is the people who just fall off the face of the earth. In the midst of all this hatred, when red or blue are at their throats more than anything, if you're watching that map, this divided country, red and blue, if you start watching chunks of that map go dark, just go black, disappear off the face of the earth, that's a serious problem. And I would really, really, really be concerned about those growing black masses on the map. And I know they are growing, because this year in particular, and I have no doubt it's a little bit of algorithm sort of timeline curation, given my interests and my beliefs. But it feels like a lot more of that map is turning more and more black, and they're turning their back to the institution of state and federal government as they're realizing they're useless and they've only been a net negative. As someone who's been put in a position of power, who is watching that map of votes trickle in, the more black mass you see on that map, the more scared you are going to be of stepping out of line to those people, because at a subconscious level, and maybe you're too stupid to know, but the fact of the matter is, those people now who don't identify or don't fly any of your stupid flags hate both of you, hate everyone across the board equally, no matter what. And now you have to live with the fact there's a very large growing number of individuals who have completely tuned out of your rhetoric, your propaganda, your little hate machine. And the more you choose to fuck them, and remember, these people did not consent to you, they didn't vote, so they've completely turned their back to you. The more you continue to fuck them, the angrier they are going to be, and they have already tuned out of whatever thing you've thrown on society that a lot of people are tuned into that keep you in power. These people operate outside of that little system, and I would be, and they should be, very scared of those growing black masses on the map. And that's all I'll say about that, and that's sort of why I sort of occupy the stance that I do on this subject. It's completely subject to change. I do not identify with my beliefs on things. I think you have to be a little fluid in your beliefs. You have to be able to challenge them, and I'm willing to talk it out. Haven't been able to talk it out with somebody yet who's able to really think of it in a real, what's the politically correct word here? In a real coherent manner, it ends up getting devolved into, oh, well, by not voting, you're just voting for blue, or by not voting, you're just voting for, red. Oh, you're a Kamal supporter if you don't vote. That's what it ends up devolving into, and then there's no coming back from that. But anywho, I'm running out of time here. Interesting topic, actually, peer-reviewed paper came out. And this is important because speaking of selections, one of your officials is going on talking about price and rent controls. But a summary of results was reported in rent control effects through the lens of empirical research. I think that was the title of the paper. It's been peer-reviewed, and it took 60-plus studies in the case of where rent control was enacted in different localities in this country. I believe it's in this country. I'll have to go back and double check. These look like, yes, NAHB, so it's in the US. And overall, net negative, it turns out. When the government gets involved and tries to fuck with supply and demand, it doesn't fucking work. And I thought the cheese tunnels, thank you, Wendigoon, might have taught them that. But if you need further evidence, I'll paste the picture up as well, and I'll provide the link. So yes, rent control did lower the rents in areas where rent-controlled units were built. And again, this isn't like a widespread nationwide thing. Rent and price controls only get enacted in certain pockets, certain geographic areas, zip codes, however they decide to do it in this country. But 50 of 60 studies found that there was a significant lower rent, in rent-controlled units. However, outside of those areas where rent was controlled, higher rents were observed in every other unit. It was 16 out of 17 studies found that. There was reduced construction of new housing net overall nationwide when rent control was enacted. There was a reduced supply of housing because of that overall. There was a higher home ownership rate, it says, though, oddly enough. So 13 of 22 studies find a statistically significant positive effect of rent control on the home ownership rate, conventionally taken as a sign that there is an insufficient number of units available for rent. However, 3 of the 22 studies find a significant negative effect. So it seems to be a little conflicted, right? It's saying there is a higher home ownership rate, but there are much fewer units available for rent, maybe due to the fact that the rent-controlled units have already been taken up, and all the other rental units around that are so expensive that people are forced into maybe, cheaper, poorer sort of like starter homes, if you will. Maybe that's one explanation for that. But another interesting one right below that says there is a reduced quality of rent-controlled units observed, meaning that those rent-controlled units, those cheaper ones that the government mandated, it turns out they weren't really built all that well. They're pretty shitty. Government housing, slums, favelas, that's sort of the energy I get from this. And there was reduced residential mobility, even more so favela and slum type beat, whereas you get stuck, you get pigeonholed in that shitty little government housing, not even housing, just government rental, and you don't really get to get out of that. So I thought that was interesting. And then below that, an even funnier chart showed the percentage of multifamily developers that avoid building in jurisdictions with rent control. And 87.5% of multifamily developers do avoid building in these stupid rent-controlled jurisdictions. So it won't work. It cannot work. Government intervention is only a net negative. And as hard as it is to be paying the prices you do for groceries and rent and everything else, I understand how that might sound great. It's impossible for any government interference to be a net positive. It just cannot work. It's impossible. On the last 3 minutes here, quick stop at Uncle Ted's Corner. An oyster mushroom controlled robot. Do what you will with that. And the last thing I wanted to touch on, Stoic related, right? Because the quote really wasn't too Stoic this time around. It was more so selection themed. Paul Harrell, obviously, passed away. And if you want a masterclass on facing the topic of death in a Stoic sort of mindset, a Stoic sort of paradigm, Paul Harrell would be your case study for that. Now, I fully admit I was not a consumer of his until I had heard the news of his diagnosis and saw the community sort of rally behind him. And even then, when I did watch some of his videos, I found myself absolutely captivated by his, his later stuff, specifically his content with Garantham, that interview he did. And if you haven't watched it, you need to watch the video that was released upon his passing. He recorded last year in the winter, I believe, before he passed. And you can tell that death is right behind his shoulder. You can tell he does not have time. He tells you he does not have time. He was given months to live, and his body was deteriorating very quickly. And even, despite the physical evidence of it, by the way he talked, by the way he thought, at least as someone observing through a camera, because that's all I have to go off of, he dealt with that shit like an absolute unit. He kept his, his funny sort of sense of humor. He kept his personality. It never went away. He never, sort of sunk into a corner and said, "Woe is me, this fucking sucks," and just disappeared off the face of the earth, which would be a very, understandable thing to do given the diagnosis and how shitty it was. But please go watch that video. I mean, he apologized for his own early death, which is just what a Paul Harrell thing to do. But an absolute legend. And so please go watch that video if you haven't. It's just, if you're not familiar with, the Stoic view, go read some Stoic quotes on death. You can Google them. You'll find like the top 50 or 30, however many quotes there are. And then just watch that last little video. And even the Grantham interview, because that's also very good as well. But that man, you can tell, was not going to let the natural process of death that comes for us all, even though it was a little early for him, take away who he was to himself, to the world, to those who saw him. And it was a real inspiration, and I just smiled the whole way through when I just sort of observed that. It was very, very cool to see put into practice on a very large stage, where the diagnosis was not kind, it was not pleasant, it was not generous in any way, shape, or form. And he dealt with that shit like an absolute warrior. So I wanted to call that out because that was absolutely worth calling out. That's a great thing to end it on, especially a very heavy solo episode. It's probably a little incoherent because I'm rambling in a little square in the office as people are walking by and probably hearing me. But HTA next week, not sure if I'm going to be able to record over that weekend. It's pretty jam-packed days. I'm going to bring this stuff. Maybe I get some of the idiots on and we can get something done. But if I am late again, I do apologize. I will try to work on that. But as you know, I'm not somebody who's just a content goblin who can just throw stuff out there for the sake of throwing stuff out there because some things say I need to post at this time, how many times a week. I post when I have something meaningful to talk about. I post when I'm doing something fun or that I care about. And that's sort of how I go about it. That being said, I do want to be better, but I can't force anything. Until then, though, just stay safe. Football's back, and I know the argument against that is, bread and circuses. Well, there's no bread and there's only really circuses at this point. So as long as you're not completely hypnotized and bought into the psyop that is circuses, if that is your belief as to what it is, enjoy fun things. Have fun. Hang out with your boys, enjoy a cigar, a beer, watch a football game, if that's your thing. If not, that's fine too. But don't be ashamed of, having those sort of guilty pleasures, if you will. Do stuff for fun. The world's crazy. You got to have a little bit of fun. That's part of your purpose. But anyways, until next time, stay metal.